Plasma and Blood. Scout of the Endless Frontier Episode 10. By Elton Gar. The fight was coming to them, and Elias still didn't see any way they could win. They might have a chance against a mercenary group by using the mine as a fortress. Perhaps that would even be better than 50-50 with the experts that Holt had hired. But that was before he had seen that their leader had executive-level power armor. There probably weren't more than 100 of those suits in the Commonwealth. But worse, it signified that Helix Dynamics had enough interest in taking this backwater mining planet to send something that valuable out to the frontier. That meant the corporations were finally taking a more direct role in controlling the frontier. The only good news, if you could call it that, was that their team hadn't abandoned Holt. Of those, the only one that had a good reason to remain here was Rial Tarek, because the security bracelets and anklets he was wearing would kill him if he tried to leave. Not that he had paid any attention to them. He had instead focused almost entirely on the few boxes of equipment that Holt had got him. Elias had seen some of it, and all he got from glancing at it was that Rial was smarter than him. Something that he had already known. Their stealth expert also made some sense, he supposed. They never came out of hiding. Instead, reporting in on a secured channel with a distorted voice every hour, telling them that the enemy hadn't returned. Elias simply assumed that they had a stealth ship hidden somewhere nearby and would leave as soon as they were in actual danger. But that left Kivas and Jessa. Jessa, the Beatrian, hadn't explained why she had come or what she expected to get out of this fight. She'd be paid, of course, but Commonwealth credits didn't do you much good if you were dead. But she had made herself useful, which was enough for Elias. Because while you couldn't really teach humans how to fight like a Beatrian, who had 3 times their strength, she did a fairly good impression of power armor, allowing the miners to learn what to do when facing it. Mostly, that involved avoiding any type of direct confrontation. But getting used to the idea that you could retreat safely was a useful skill in a battle where that was going to be a significant part of their strategy. The person he trusted the least was Kivas. He didn't care what Holt said. He wasn't just creepy because of his genetic alterations. The reflective glasses that hid his odd eyes helped some, but they didn't cover up the rest of his personality. And the augmentations were a problem because the only people in the Commonwealth who could make that type of modification were Helix Dynamics. So why would he go up against them directly? Knowing the answer didn't help. He enjoyed killing, but he was far too important to any success they might have to not use. And he had also improved his tech. Elias hadn't seen that type of tech before, but the Nexa Corporation logos on the side suggested quality. Each of the 3 boxes he had brought in included its own sniper rifle, along with the sensors and comm systems that Nexa was known for. That would let him control those guns from a remote location. No ordinary sniper could afford those, since you were almost guaranteed to lose them, but with Key's augmentations, they made each of those almost as dangerous as him being there himself.
Do you have a bolt hole somewhere?
Elias asked, trying to feel out Key's plan.
If there was a back way out of this mine, don't you think the miners would know about it?
Kivas said, and as he did, one of the small spheroid drones that he had been using to map the entire area landed in his hand. It connected to something built into his hand, and he smiled.
There are natural caves on this planet. Some of them are connected to the mines. So no, they wouldn't know.
Key grinned. Elias didn't know why making his mouth too wide was useful to Key, but the smile was far too big for someone who was genetically unaltered. He then smoothed out the snakeskin jacket that he wore and said,
If you're looking for a way out, it's going to cost you.
You're being paid,
Elias said.
And paid well. But I get paid to shoot people, not give directions.
Elias didn't bother to continue the conversation. If there was a way out, It seemed unlikely that Key was going to tell him, even for a price. He still wasn't sure. Key didn't plan on turning his guns on them and collect a bonus from Helix. As the only one who could really train them, Elias spent his time with the miners. He showed them the best places for ambush, helped them set up traps and prepared a plan. But mostly, he tried to prepare them for battle, even though it was impossible to be truly prepared for. The enemy delayed their attack longer than Elias expected. But 3 days wasn't even enough for a basic boot camp. So when the stealth expert told them that 3 troop ships were landing, Elias calmed himself, took his position and prepared to fight. Their biggest advantage was that the enemy would have to funnel first through the small valley that led to the narrow mine entrance. A curved concrete tunnel about 50 feet long and barely big enough for 2 people to walk side by side. An advantage that could be almost entirely countered by the single executive-level power armor. The man could simply walk in, stand in front of the entrance, and without firing a shot, take away their best advantage. But he didn't do that. Instead, Elias watched almost 400 men walk out of those troop ships in basic military uniforms and simple guns. What was the point of executive-level power armor if you led from the back? He almost felt bad for them, as Holt moved in with 24 combat drones. Each of them was about the size of a football and roughly the same shape. And say what you wanted about Holt, you had to admit he was good with the drones. They moved too fast to be easily shot out of the sky and spread out as they flew into the thickest parts of the army, and just above, the soldiers' heads exploded. The enemy ships were already in the air as the soldiers, seeing that they were being slaughtered, began to panic. But that helped them more than almost anything, as the tightly packed and well-organized lines let Holt blow up dozens at a time. But as they scattered, the explosions hit only a handful.
Hold on the sniper,
Elias said, as the scattered enemies began to regroup. If there was any value in this massive waste of human life, it was to test their defenses. Better not to give them any extra information. It appeared to Elias that almost half of the enemy's first wave was dead from Holt's drones. But it took only minutes for the troop ships to return with more soldiers. Holt's handful of remaining drones were of minor value. But as they neared the entrance, a rock exploded. The miners had placed explosives in a few of them. And while far lower tech than Holt's drones, the explosion was much larger, creating a significant hole in the middle of the advancing army and injuring many outside of that with the shards of rock that were thrown outward.
Hold back on the other explosives,
Elias said. They were fighting this entire battle backwards. If the enemy commander, Victor Holloway, was going to keep back his best, then they needed to keep back theirs too. But that didn't mean holding back entirely. And as was planned, the first of Kivos's sniper positions came online. Elias didn't know where Key actually was, but the distance didn't seem to matter. The sniper rifle's design was similar in some ways to the Talon, though its size meant that it packed a much bigger punch. The only thing on this battlefield that Key couldn't kill would be whoever was in the power armor. And he was focused on the squad commanders. Each of his shots hitting one of them, and most injuring people behind them. It wouldn't stop the enemy army. It wouldn't even significantly slow them, but every shot spread fear and made their leadership less effective. More importantly, it might force Commander Holloway to take the battlefield, because while that power armor was going to be almost impossible to stop, it was also the only way that they were going to end this fight. The sniper position didn't last long. With every shot, more of the enemy soldiers located it and began to fire. Key only got off 2 more shots before one of them got lucky. The fighting at the entrance was where things got bloody. The mass of soldiers pushed those at the front into the narrow tunnel and into the wide-open caves where they were immediately shot. Key's second position was the most dangerous, as it shot through multiple soldiers with every shot, not only killing them, but making it harder for the others to move forward. And Elias fired as well, popping out every few seconds to fire the Talon. Alone that wouldn't have stopped them, but it slowed them. Then at the prescribed time, the gunfire stopped. The pause was only a few seconds, but in that time, a group of 30 confused enemy soldiers were pushed forward by the mass of humanity behind them. That was when Jessa and the strongest of the miners came in. This was one of the riskiest parts of the plan. If it failed, the entire battle could collapse. But it had to be done. They needed the enemy weapons. Watching a Betrian fight was always impressive. The species was best compared to an Earth grizzly bear, but with intelligence that was a match for any human. And unlike the Betrian pirates he had fought, Jessa was well trained and prepared for a fight. He saw a couple of sparks as her thick metal armor was hit by bullets. That had to hurt, but she showed no signs of it as she attacked with both hands. Every blow tossed one of the enemy soldiers into others, and the ferocity and close quarters made it difficult for any of them to even raise their guns. The humans that moved with her held anything they could use as a weapon. There were wrenches and picks, as well as one man who held a plasma cutter. Key's sniping began before the hand-to-hand combat was over, his shots slipping between soldiers and slowing the endless stream of enemies to allow Jessa and the miners to retreat away from the enemy. But unlike before, many of them were now carrying guns. Once they were back far enough, Elias joined too. But this time, the cave also echoed with the sounds of gunshots. It wasn't ideal. At least half of the miners who had rushed in were killed, and without extra ammo, the guns wouldn't last long. But if they drove the enemy back, they'd get more guns and more ammo. It took an agonizingly long time for the stream of men to stop. But the looks on the faces of the men as they were pushed forward spoke to the desire. Some of them threw themselves to the ground to avoid the gunfire, but were trampled by those behind them. Others shot back, but most of them just died. Once there was a few seconds to catch his breath, Elias grabbed his tablet and said,
"How is it going outside?"
2 troop ships have just landed, and the first one is about to launch again. But I have already placed the first charge.
Elias shouldn't be surprised.
"Blow up the first. Plant the others, but let's leave them a good way to escape for now."
There was no answer, except after a second, a massive explosion as the ship that was about to take off exploded. The men began to jump from the other ships. But these weren't men panicking. They were the more elite troops that Elias had been expecting. Part of the reason that dropships rarely landed was to avoid the type of charge that had taken out the first ship. That was a problem because while the battle might last longer, 2 troop ships were still enough to overwhelm them. Then he saw something he didn't expect. His first sighting of their stealth expert. It was little more than a shimmer of the light, but it reminded him of the enemy he had fought on the station just before he found out about the Nexari. There was no way to know if it was the same species, though it was plausible. But either way, he saw that shimmer lift off the ground. It was hard to follow, but he saw it moving toward the enemy ships, a line of fire appearing as it flew, pinpointing its location.
I've done what I can. You're all on your own now,
the distorted voice said, and then it hit one of the 2 remaining enemy ships and exploded. 100 well-trained soldiers in much better armor began to advance on the mine. They would break through the line given a reasonable chance, and Rial had already told him his plan wouldn't work against the commander's power armor, so Elias said,
"Rial, I was hoping to keep you in reserve longer, but it's time."
Elias didn't know what the man's plan was. All he knew was that Rial had promised it would work once, and he could hit whatever target Elias wanted. So he pinpointed the highest ranking of the enemy crack troops and hoped. A second later, a streak of light shot into the air from the other side of the town, and then, once it was 100 yards in the air, shot forward so fast that it left a line in the air behind it. Elias expected another explosion like the drone, but after about 10 seconds the man the light hit just fell over. At the same time, other lights appeared. Each one of them delayed about as long as it might take to pick the target out that Elias had suggested. Then a few seconds later, they collapsed, and Elias had no idea why. Even the trained soldiers seemed shook by that. And Elias understood. Being shot at was one thing, but not knowing what was killing you was something else entirely. The only real problem, besides him only being able to do that once, was that it forced them to move forward. And this time the assault was much worse. 3 of the elite troops moved a large piece of metal down the short tunnel, giving the other soldiers cover so they could flood in. Kivas still shot, but he had to wait until they were further into the cave and there were men behind those metal walls that could fire back, so that soon it became too dangerous for Elias to fire at all. It should have been the end. The enemy troops were moving in fast, and would have easily shot most of the miners if they tried to retreat. But Jessa rushed forward. She hit one of those pieces of metal with the full force of her body, knocking it backwards and leaving a gap that she moved through. Then, for a brief moment, Elias was reminded why the Betrians were considered the most dangerous hand-to-hand combatants in the Commonwealth. Anyone else would have retreated or been killed before they could. But the stories were that Betrians never retreated. They simply attacked until their enemy was dead. Her armor and strength let her drive the mass of soldiers back, every blow killing a soldier. Even the more elite soldiers were tossed aside as she took her place in the tunnel. As shocked as he was, Elias almost forgot to stop shooting, but she deserved better than her sacrifice being wasted because he was too impressed by it, and there were still soldiers on this side of the door tunnel that could shoot her in the back. So he took aim every 3.5 seconds and shot. He got 5 shots off before she went down. Far longer than anyone should have been able to hold that tunnel, and enough time for the soldiers inside to be killed and the makeshift defenses to be torn down. It had given them the time they needed, but the men flooding in now were better trained. It was time for a break.
Blow it now.
Elias spoke into the calm. 2 more of the rocks outside exploded. He didn't have time to see how much damage that did, but more importantly, 2 charges in the tunnel exploded, collapsing it and dropping tons of rocks onto the men and Jessa, who had likely saved all their lives with her sacrifice. There was a cheer from the miners, but it wasn't enthusiastic. This wasn't a victory. The enemy commander hadn't even entered the fight, and the cost had been too high. Of the people who had come to defend them, 3 were out of the fight. That left only Key, Holt, Rust, and Elias.
Everyone salvage what you can. I want to see every one of those guns being used when the next attack comes,
Elias said. The wait was in some ways worse for morale than the battle. In the fight, there hadn't been time to consider the danger or the losses. But it was going to take hours or days for the enemy to clear that tunnel. That gave time for the adrenaline to wear off, and for them to clear the bodies. It was a terrible job that Elias and the others were spared, as the miners wanted to do it themselves. While they were preparing and resting, Elias was reminded of the bigger battle, one that he had almost forced out of his mind while focusing on this little one. The parallels seemed clear, even down to the proxies being sent in first to wear down the enemy. But in both battles, the key would have to be defeating the real enemy. And while he didn't know as much about the Nexari, who were nearly godlike in their powers, the power armor was a threat he could at least face.
We can still try to escape. Those caverns might connect to the surface, and even if they don't, digging an escape hole wouldn't be impossible,
Elias said. It wasn't his position to say it, and Holt looked irritated at the suggestion, but it needed to be done, because if the miners were going to give up, it needed to be before the fight.
This is our world,
one of the miners said. The others seemed to gather strength from that defiance, though some of them glanced towards the caves.
Then we have to make the fight painful. We won't keep them out this time, but we can make them bleed for every inch.
They all knew the plan. The mines and the attached caves were a maze, one that even the miners didn't fully know. But most of them disappeared deeper into the caves where they had stashed supplies. From there, they would wear down the enemy in every way they could, from ambushes to sabotage. The fights would be brutal, and the miners would lose as often as they won, but evening the odds was all they could hope for. With almost everyone gone, Holt, Elias and Rust watched the last of the rocks slowly be pulled away. As soon as the first opening appeared, Elias shot through the tiny gap with the talon. He couldn't see anything, but someone had to be moving those rocks out of the way. That slowed the progress, but they continued to pull the rocks out of the tunnel. And as the gap got wider, Key's remote sniper began to fire too. If he hadn't come here to kill him, Elias could have felt bad for the first of the soldiers who pushed through that gap. He had to know he'd be killed, but he widened the gap as he went in, and more rocks were pulled out with his body. Elias had never had that type of bravery. A few minutes later, they finally truly broke through, and everyone left in the mine entrance began their retreat, shooting just enough to make moving towards the back of the cave safe as the enemy took control of the entrance and began to return fire, making it safer for more to enter. Elias let Holt give the next order. Holt shouted, and 2 backhoes and a forklift rushed the enemy line. The thick metal of the machinery had been augmented with any piece of metal they could weld to keep the drivers safe. They weren't armed like tanks, but none of the men had the equipment to destroy a forklift, so the machines broke their line one last time before the drivers were forced to flee. But it barely mattered. Commander Victor Holloway had decided to join the battle. But as much as Elias wanted to shoot him, he focused his fire on men he could actually hurt, then ducked behind the jagged stone pillar, the talon's hum rising as its charge rebuilt. Rust growled beside him, low and sharp, ears flattened as the sound of gunfire filled the cavern. Holt crouched low near the broken ore hauler, rifle bucking in steady bursts. The shots did nothing against the armor, but he shot far faster, and the unarmored soldiers were forced to take cover. It wasn't enough. Commander Holloway didn't order his men to fight. Instead, he stepped forward carefully, the bounce in his step reminding Elias that he wasn't skilled with the armor, and with no other good targets, Elias shot the commander. The plasma shot hit the armor's electromagnetic shield half an inch out from the armor and lit up the entire suit. That suit was likely nuclear-powered. Well, they had planned for this. A bad plan that was unlikely to work even if he survived long enough to try it, but it was a plan.
Holt, cover me.
Elias ran, keeping low, Rust following at his heels. He reached the first plasma cutter and yanked loose the power couplings. Sparks spat as he bypassed the safety relays, overcharging the emitter. The tool hummed to life, heat shimmering around the tip with light that was brighter than the sun, throwing harsh light across the cavern walls and drawing the attention of Victor. With a range of a couple of inches, Elias was an easy target. But Holloway had something to prove, and evidently that wasn't that he was smart, because he began to walk towards Elias and directly below the massive crane used for moving the gigantic pieces of metal equipment around the cavern. Once he was where Elias needed, one of the miners who had remained hidden used the massive metal grip to grab Victor and lifted him off the ground. It wouldn't hold him long. All Holloway had to do was focus on those metal arms with any of his weapons. But instead, he activated the jump boots that did nothing since his feet weren't on the ground. This was their chance, and Elias was the only one who could do it. He rushed the man, driving the plasma cutter into him. The electronic shield that stopped energy caused the arch to spread across it for a second, but then the metal moved past the shield. Elias felt a tingle from the shield, but it only stopped energy weapons. Bullets and other simple weapons were the reason it had inch-thick metal armor. He wasn't going to get through that armor fast, but he aimed the plasma cutter for the joints. It felt painfully long, but it was likely only seconds before the first of the joints froze. After 2 more, the armor sagged as its engines began to fail. The armor, still caught in the clamp, twitched and struggled, but it couldn't break free. Then the visor lifted, and Elias saw Victor, his face red and covered in sweat, as the heat from the plasma cutter threatened to boil him alive inside the suit. 100 soldiers watched Elias face down Commander Calloway. The only one still at his side was Rust. Even Holt was 50 yards away. Elias lifted the Talon up, so it was only a few inches from the commander's face, and said,
"I think we should negotiate the mineral rights to this planet."
There were a few tense seconds, but Elias felt no real danger. The man could order his soldiers to attack, but they couldn't do it fast enough to stop Elias from pulling the trigger on the Talon. And the only reason that he was still alive was that he knew that if he killed him, the miners would just end up fighting this battle again in a few months.
Fine. I'll make an agreement with them,
Calloway said.
Good. And I'll make sure it's a profitable deal for you. Enough that it's not worth a fight to try and change it.
Elias said, thinking about the many people on both sides that were dead. A few hours later, the deal was struck. The miners would hold the rights to the minerals, but Helix Biologics, through its intermediates, would be given the first chance to buy it. A solution that, if they were lucky, might keep the miners from having to fight another battle. Author's note:
My original plan with this story was to have almost all of the characters except Elias die. A major setback for someone who has significant survivor's guilt. But I backed off on that just a hair, mostly because these are some of the first characters I've introduced that have a reasonable chance of showing back up, and I thought that was more fun. The reason for their death was, of course, that this was, in its original concept, an homage to the Seven Samurai or the Magnificent Seven. But I think that it's more important to try to tell a good story than it is to stick to a concept or a theme. So, there is a good chance that some of these characters may show up again. If you enjoyed this, consider signing up for my newsletter at sci-fi.com or visiting my Patreon at patreon.com/Elton to get the next episode a week early. Thank you. Elton Gar.